Hey everybody, it's always great to connect with you, especially this week. This is the week that, if you will recall, over a number of weeks ago, the Rand was trading much higher. And now, over the last couple of days, the Rand is starting to strengthen. Now, you might wonder why. I'm telling you now, it's because Kaizer Chiefs won the Nedbank Cup. If Kaizer Chiefs had not won, the Rand would have been deteriorating. So, thank you to Amakosi for lifting the national mood and strengthening the currency. This is always a good thing. But this week, also some other interesting news came through. There have been a number of things that are taking place. I think the most difficult news is the fact that the quarterly labor force survey came out and indicates worsening conditions of unemployment. So today, I want to speak a little bit about the dire need that South Africa needs for economic growth. And that's what we're going to focus on today, because actually an economy that's been growing at less than 1% for the last 10 years is an economy that is not only keeping up, that is failing to keep up with population growth. It means that the South African economy is running out of money to be able to finance its social wage. So that is indeed a crisis. More than 49 white South Africans leaving on refugee status, more than any other crisis. The reality of it is that the economy is our biggest crisis. And that's what we've got to focus on, and that's what we've got to talk about. The other issue is the fact that even on the risk of politics, the reality of it is that it's immaterial. Some of the material issues, such as President Trump's tariffs, whatever else is happening in the geopolitical world, ours is to fight for an economy that is growing. And often you can get many economists to argue this issue. I think that we've got to pick a path, begin to invest towards that path, create savings towards that path, learn from countries who have grown in the same rate, and then begin to say, what does South Africa need to do to get more people working? So with that in mind, let me begin by saying, I think it's possible to grow at a rate higher than the population. It's why the growth charter, which I will speak about in a moment, suggests that we can be able to grow at 5%. Other countries have done it. When you look at what Rwanda has done, and sure, others might argue it's coming from a low base, but it was able to achieve 8.4% GDP growth last year. Ghana and Tanzania both grew by 5% in 2024. And when you look at other bigger economies, for example, when you look at India, that has grown at 4%. That's been an incredible story. We're still seeing some of China's growth, although it's starting to taper down a little bit. But let us face reality. At least in our peer countries, we used to historically be in the top half of that list. Now we're at the bottom half of that list. So regardless of how we look at things, it's going to be important that we come back to our continent and say, is South Africa as one of the biggest economies in the continent? How do we compete with other peer countries in the continent and grow at the same rates as they are? And so it's going to be crucial. The National Development Plan, which has been the lodestar that guides what we are trying to achieve, suggests that we need to be growing at 5.4% if we're going to keep up with population growth. For those of you who are wondering why I keep harping on about this issue, is because if you're not growing at the rate higher than your population, it means people are ending up unemployed. And unemployment numbers are deeply, deeply worrying. The reality of it is that we have now moved our unemployment literally, meaning that in a potential labor force of 42 million, only 16.8 million people are working. Now, yes, what that means is that in fact, more than 43% of citizens in this country are not working. That is in essence conditions upon which you could quite safely say the government has failed to live up to its constitutional mandate. I actually maintain that if we were to do anything about the Constitution, is to say GDP growth must be an indicator of the health of whether that government is working or not. You can't just keep a government in place that keeps failing on this very fundamental constitutional issue. That is, if you don't produce growth, in actual fact, you end up with citizens who not only are unemployed, but face the worst levels of poverty. And more crucially, when you look at young people, what is the prospect of a young person if in the ages of 15 to 35, nearly 3/4 of them, or nearly 72.4% of them, cannot find work. Look, when you are 15, you begin to articulate your dreams. You begin to say, here's what you want to do and all of that. Imagine studying medicine and ending up being unemployed. Imagine studying teaching and ending up being unemployed. Imagine if you went to a vocational training college and still end up unemployed. I think South Africa does not do enough to inspire the hopes and dreams of our young people, particularly those in ages of 15 to 24. And on an expanded definition of unemployment, when you look at those who are 25 to 34, that picture doesn't change. It means that more than half of them, 50% of them, are unemployed on a broad definition. This is a crisis. You know, I've got cousins, friends, family members who are unemployed. The life of the unemployed is hard. It means the economic conditions are such that it exacerbates inequality. And what's tough about that is that you watch others get on a train, or at least a few others who get on the train towards prosperity, and you get left behind. I think we should never get surprised when we see our levels of crime, when we see levels of poverty, when we see economic conditions that are unsafe. It makes us realize the fact that South Africans are facing pressure. But it's no use getting depressed about it. What's important is that we begin to take deliberate action. Action that will ensure that we begin to grow. Some economists are already writing us off as a 1% economy. Others are saying we're just a 2% economy. I beg to differ. I think we can do better, and I think we can look at this issue of economic growth by simply saying to us, how do we adjust and maximize the opportunities that some of them are presenting before us? As the geopolitics are taking place between China and the US, it means South Africa has an opportunity along with the African continent. We can look at the population dividend in this continent and say, where are the 1.4 billion Africans going to require goods from? Why is South Africa not wanting to become more of a manufacturing hub around goods as we transition towards greener energy, being the place that manufactures this, the battery center of the world? Why can we not look at investment in infrastructure such as rail, particularly domestically here in South Africa, where we can say we can create a loop between Gauteng, Northwest, Free State, Mpumalanga, so that we can enhance tourism, but also focus on the building of that infrastructure. There is economic activity that we need to look at. And I know many of us would say to us that yes, some of the constraints have been around energy, but we've also seen that even last year, with nearly most of the year us having energy in the country, still did not deliver the economic growth that we needed. Instead, last year, I think quarter on average, we would have grown at less than 1% or 0.6, 0.7%. It means we have to do something more than just simply keeping the lights on. We've got to do something about, first and foremost, solving for our politics. I really believe that it is not helpful for stability and for future planning when you have a political instability where parties within even the GNU, some of them are in court, some of them are out of court, the pronouncements publicly don't sound cohesive, and now we face Budget 3.0 next week, Wednesday, where ultimately we've got to ensure that these things come from a harmonized political environment. We've got to give political certainty, because along with unemployment, a crisis in the economy is the fact that what is called growth capital formation, or the rate of investment, is a crisis. South Africa, relative to other peer countries, is underinvesting. Domestic investors are not putting money into the economy. So if domestic investors are not doing that, how do international investors follow suit? You can't invest in a country where the people within the country don't want to do that. And relative to other countries, we are falling way behind in terms of the rate of investment. So let us create a political stability so that we can stimulate and inspire people to be able to not only invest in this country, but ultimately, even for consumers who have disposable income, to begin to spend it in our own country. It's why, as Build One South Africa, we put together this growth charter. Because we think, actually, if we were beginning to attend to the questions of growth, we could see an economy that grows. The first one is, let's improve the ease of doing business. The regulatory frame in this country sometimes can become harder for anyone wanting to start a business. Let's make it easier. Let's make it such that you can register a business quick enough. You can get that business connected to water and electricity through a municipality easier. And let's make sure that ultimately your ability to trade, to be tax compliant, is also made easier. The sense upon which businesses have to go through hoops and loops to try and do business is hard. It's what, in some ways, encourages businesses trading illegally. And in certain instances, it's why you end up with this dichotomy of lack of investment, particularly in the SMME sector. Let's make the ease of doing business a priority in this country. We can't just stand up and say South Africa is open for business and fail the basic task of making it easier for people to trade. Secondly, I think accelerating infrastructure investment. Our debt to GDP ratio is now at 75%. Most economists, at least rating agencies, project that our debt to GDP will increase in the medium term. What we desperately need is that if you are to increase debt, let's not borrow to pay for goods and just services, or borrow just to keep people employed, or cost of employees, which are the big budget ticket items. What we've got to do is borrow to build infrastructure. And infrastructure build is the fundamentally most important thing. It must allow us to modernize our logistics, our transportation, so that goods and people can move around this country easier. Thirdly, we've got to unlock public-private partnerships. And now that's not only a financing question when we talk about blended financing, but it's also a question of saying, when we look at even a construction sector, how do we ensure that as we invest more in infrastructure, the private sector can participate? We can build a massive rollout of infrastructure in the medium term if we're willing to enhance some of these public-private partnerships going forward. And so certainly any funding, any mechanisms that assist this is going to be crucial going forward. We've got to expand support to SMMEs. And this is where, as BOSA, we are very committed to the Jobs and Justice Fund. I know the state is promulgating a transformation fund. We want to look at a Jobs and Justice Fund. So that where legislation is cumbersome, like BBBEE or all of that kind of legislation, we can make it easier for people to direct funding towards the transformation, or towards the transformation of our economy, by putting together a Jobs and Justice Fund. The fund will help fund SMMEs. It will also direct finances towards education, so that more and more young people can be skilled to get through, so it can fully participate in the economy. But we also want to make sure that we stimulate and we support SMMEs. Fifthly, we think the labor market reform is important. This is about making sure that you can create contracts and working conditions for people that reduce barriers to entry for younger workers, but also protecting your workers' rights, but also incentivizing people to create more jobs. You see, to me, if you look at a business today in South Africa, the question we should be putting on is that, along with the many things we ask businesses to do, the one thing we should focus on like laser is to say, is that business adding more people to work? It to me is more paramount that a business is actually employing more and more people. And that's why labor reform becomes absolutely crucial. We've got to ensure that we're energy secure and energy resilient. This is about transitioning our energy sector, but also making sure that we don't, as we speak today, you and I, we've already got load shedding stage 2. We've got to make sure that where there's capability within municipalities, those municipalities can wheel energy into the grid. But more crucially, we introduce a diverse set of energy that can come into play. The conversation about the reform of Eskom has been long ongoing. We've now got to do it quicker and more effectively in the near while. And then lastly, or more equally as important as a resource towards the economy, no business can run without water. It's not only about whether people will come to a restaurant without water. It's also not about high mining. It's also got multiple layers. Water is an essential component of economic growth. And I want to say we've got to ensure that in how not only we deal with water licenses in the agricultural sector, but we've got to ensure that in municipalities are capable of reticulating water. And half of it has to do with how we manage water boards in municipalities. The other half is about municipalities fixing their infrastructure so that we stop losing water, what is called non-revenue water. And in the next number of weeks, I'll be engaging metros like Mangaung, Johannesburg, to figure out how exactly we make sure water is working. And then ultimately, GDP is about making sure that you've got a positive trade balance. And I think we've got to do more about promoting trade and export expansion. We've got to ensure that our balance of trade is net positive, more exports, less imports, making sure our goods are being consumed everywhere else in the world. And that can only be built on the bedrock of actually working infrastructure, export markets, and ultimately striking a deal with our biggest trading partners, notwithstanding a deal with the United States of America. The sooner we're able to do that. So to President Ramaphosa, in your meeting with President Trump next week, which has been reported about, please make sure we come back with a deal, because this is going to be important, not only to set tariffs, but to ensure that we improve on our trade. Fellow South Africans, ours is to focus on growth. We have to ensure that our economy grows. And my job is to fight for growth initiatives. We can all obsess about yesterday. We can all talk about what we've got to do, but we've got to focus on the future. But here's the salient warning. We are running out of time and we're running out of money. So economies that are well managed ask themselves the question, are we fiscally sustainable? Are we budgeting consistent with our financial resources? And are we ultimately achieving a sense upon which there's positive growth? That time has come for South Africa. Unless we become deliberate about reforms, making sure that we make the tough choices, South Africa cannot just keep going and hope for different outcomes. We cannot budget simply by just adding inflation to certain items and hoping that they will reform and suddenly perform. Now is about time to making tough choices, adopting a growth charter so that we can align all of government to work with that, and ultimately ensuring that we can achieve a South Africa that grows and creates jobs. My fight is to fight for one thing and one thing alone: jobs, jobs, jobs. When people work, they are safer, they are happier, and they are able to ensure that they break the curse of poverty from one generation to the next. So this is the struggle, this is the fight. Let's get in the ring and make sure that we reform our economy for the future. And those who are stealing money from our economy, you lot belong in jail. I can promise you that for free, because ultimately you not only rob our country's ability to grow, but in other words, you destroy our developmental agenda. So let's stand strong. If Chiefs can do it, well, more of us can. So I'm telling you now, let's keep fighting and let's build a champion nation. Much love to all of you all. See you soon.